The passing tone and the neighboring tone might represent the simplest of the non-chord tones that we discuss, in that they are both approached and left by step. So when I say that, when we talk about non-chord tones, we talk about how they appear in written music, or how we would put them into something that we were writing, and we talk about how we approach them or how we arrive at the NCT, and then how we leave them or how we resolve them. So the passing tone and the neighbor tone are both approached by step, which means they step from a chordal pitch into this non-chord tone. And they're both left by step. So now here's where the difference is. In the case of the neighbor note, you leave the note by step in the direction from whence you came. So as a result, the neighbor note or the neighboring tone is surrounded by the same pitch. And it's just a step above or a step below that original chordal pitch. Whereas the passing tone, you step into the passing tone from a chordal pitch, but then you take another step in the same direction to result in a new chord tone. Okay, so let me just kind of use this example we have in front of us here. The first thing I'll do is I'll play it. So this is a pretty simple, pretty unadorned chord progression before I've included any non-chord tones. So I'll use this progression to kind of show how we can use non-chord tones to embellish or to add some interest to what we're doing. I would like to point out that what you'll see me demonstrate are ways that we can insert non-chord tones into a progression that itself features good voice leading. Sometimes we can fall into the notion that, well, my voice leading doesn't necessarily matter. I'll just throw in passing tones or neighbors or some other non-chord tones. And sometimes non-chord tones can help us in some of the trickier voice leading segments, but we do have to make sure that our voice leading is of pretty darn good quality in order for the non-chord tones to be effective. And sometimes just adding the non-chord tones really just isn't enough to mask ineffective voice leading. So we always want to start from a place of having good, solid voice leading to begin with. So we'll start with passing tones. One of the easiest places to put a passing tone is to find two chord tones within the same voice that are a third apart. So I have that in the case of the alto here. So the alto starts on a G and then it skips down to an E flat. So what I could do is I could pretty easily put in a passing tone. I'll make the first note value a quarter note, so I'll leave room in terms of the meter, and then I'll have it pass through the F on its way to E flat. Okay, so that already adds a little bit of interest just to the upper couple of voices here. So what we hear in that example is the passing tone doing the job that it does very, very well, which is to smooth out the motion from one pitch to a somewhat more distant pitch that would otherwise require a leap. Okay, so that's one place I could put a passing tone. It's not the only place. I mean, if I wanted to, I could kind of search the score here, and anytime I found notes that were more than a step apart, I could enter a passing tone, right? So for example, in the soprano, if I wanted to leave the E flat, leaving the 1/6 chord, and have it step pass through, use this D as a passing tone here to get to a C, I could certainly do that as well. Okay, I see that I've got a bass motion here going from 4 to a 2/7. I could insert a passing tone here as well. Okay, so those are just a couple of places where I could use a passing tone. So let's hear what that sounds like together. So we already have a greater sense of smoothness, a greater sense of elegance. One thing I will point out is that in my original example, I had a pretty obvious voice exchange between the alto and the bass. Okay, so they're exchanging E flats and G's initially here, okay? And now that I've included a passing tone in the alto, the fact of the matter is I still have that same voice exchange, but I've made it a little more subtle. So that added elegance kind of disguises the more direct voice exchange we have there, okay? Okay, so that's one example of passing tones, but let's go ahead, before we leave them, and talk about how we would label them. For our purposes, what we're going to do when we're labeling non-chord tones is we're going to circle the chord, or circle the pitch that is the non-chord tone, and we're going to use an abbreviation. Okay, so for passing tones, let's go ahead and use PT, just a simple, straightforward abbreviation like that. So I've got a passing tone here. I've got the one I put in the soprano. I've got the one that I placed in the bass. So to review the behavior of passing tones in context, remember the definition is that they are approached by step and then they are resolved or left by step in the same direction. And that's what we have in each of these examples. They are approached by step, leaving a non-chord tone, and then they resolve by step in the same direction, going to another chordal tone. Okay. Now, just to be clear, you can certainly have a series of passing tones between pitches that are much farther apart. But in the end, by the time it's all said and done, we will have begun our journey on a chordal pitch and resolved it finally on another chordal pitch. So that's the case in the alto, as I just pointed out. That's the case in the soprano here. And that's the case in the bass here. In each case, the passing tone is approached and resolved by step. Now, it just so happens that all of the passing tones that I've put in here happen to be descending. And another thing that we have is that they're actually all diatonic, which means they are part of the key signature. So let's see if there's a place where we could actually include an ascending passing tone and also maybe a chromatic passing tone. So as we examine the bass, we see that there is a place where there's a pretty big gap, and it's actually the bass moving upward. So I wonder if I could put in some passing tones there. Okay. So before I assign them note values, let me just kind of make sure I know how far I'm going to go here. Okay. So the bass begins on an F, and then it's going to progress through a G, and then before it gets to B flat, it'll need to go through A flat. Okay, so I'll try to kind of put those in the same bar so that we still arrive on that B flat on the downbeat. Okay, so obviously I need to steal at least some time from this half note. So maybe what I'll do is I'll make the half note a quarter note, and I will turn these two passing tones into eighth notes. Okay, now let's see what that does for us. Before we do, let's make sure we do our labels. If I kind of run out of room, sometimes what I'll do is I'll circle the notes. Okay, and I'll write in my label and then just draw a line to them. And you see that I've used the same label for both and just drawn a line, and that just makes the page just a little bit cleaner. So let's see what this sounds like now that we've added our bass passing tones. So there we've added a bit of flourish. And how about a chromatic passing tone, right? So a passing tone that moves between pitches, but that borrows notes that aren't originally part of the key. Well, an obvious place to put a chromatic passing tone would be between two chordal pitches that are a whole step, or specifically a major second apart. There are certainly some candidates for a chromatic passing tone. For example, we could have a chromatic descent in the tenor from the B flat to the A flat. And I actually tried this out. It didn't sound all that good. So I'm going to try for another option here. Let's take a look at the soprano. The soprano has a C that descends a major second into a B flat. So let's see if we could put a chromatic passing tone, so kind of getting that half step between the two pitches, and we could see how that sounds as well. So before we write in our passing tone, or maybe after as we're revising, but at some point in the process, we do want to think about the spelling for our chromatics. Part of taking care of chromatic pitches includes thinking about what's going to make the most sense in terms of how we spell it, because when we spell it, we want to do so in a way that indicates the general direction or the impulse or the sonic gravitation of that pitch. So in this case, we know that a half step below a C is the pitch we normally call a B natural. And so we could write a B natural as a chromatic passing tone between the soprano C and B flat. However, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to write it as a C flat. And the reason I wanted to write it as a C flat is because I wanted to maintain the sense of descent from this pitch, this non-chordal pitch, into something that's a stable member of the 5 chord. So I use enharmonic spelling in a way that indicates the general direction of the line. So often when we're performing, we will have instances where we will see a composer write in a flat that we don't normally see, like a C flat or an F flat or a double flat or a double sharp, and sometimes we can wonder, well, why did they put that in? And in many cases, it's really about showing, again, the overall motion of that line. So what I think I'll actually do is, before I do my labeling, I'm going to be a little bit pickier. I'm going to move my C flat over so that it aligns metrically with the same beat I have in the G and the bass here. Okay, so there's a little bit better alignment here, and I do want to make sure I go ahead and label my passing tone. Now, if we're being very, very picky, we can actually add to our label, instead of just putting PT, we could put a CPT, and that C stands for chromatic. So we're just being very, very clear that this is a chromatic passing tone. Personally, I prefer to have that level of detail, but for our purposes right now, as long as we can identify that it's a passing tone, I think that will suffice for now. So let's see what it sounds like now that we've added this passing tone. Now I'm back at having a clean slate, back to my original progression, where I'll take some time to look for opportunities to add in neighbors or neighbor notes. So neighbor notes, because they resolve and, because we approach them and resolve them in opposing step, as I mentioned before, really it's just going to be a way of prolonging the same pitch. So when we're looking at neighbors, we want to look at pitches that overall are going to essentially stay stable, or at least for a short period of time, and then we can stick in either an upper neighbor or a lower neighbor. So let's talk about upper neighbors first, just because. I think an easy place to put in an upper neighbor would be here in the soprano, where I could make the E flat a quarter note, and then simply step up to an F, and then that F, because I approach by step in an ascending fashion, neighbor says that I have to resolve by step in a descending fashion, because those are in opposite directions. Okay, so this would be called an upper neighbor, but for our purposes, we can just call it a neighbor note. If you want to add the U to indicate that it's an upper neighbor, that's fine. But just labeling it as a neighbor note for now will suffice. So what I did is I used a neighbor note to kind of bide the pitch's time, since it was going to be a sustained pitch or a common tone anyway. And so I just kind of gave it something to do while it was hanging on to its chordal pitch. I don't necessarily have to wait till I'm about to change chords, though. I could use a neighbor before I change harmonies. So let's look at that in the case of perhaps the alto. Let's look at the leading tone right here near the end of the tune. What if we were to take this whole note, give it a neighbor before we leave the bar? In this case, why not? Let's do a lower neighbor, and then allow it to return to the same pitch for the duration of the bar. So I'll make sure to label my non-chord tone. In addition to our regular old neighbors, we also have what's sometimes called a neighbor group, or what's called a double neighbor. And that is where we take advantage of the neighbor notes on both sides, or both above and below the pitch in question. So one candidate for that is we can use the tenor. The tenor in the second bar, the A flat, since it's hanging out on the A flat anyway, maybe we can just kind of let it dance around a little bit. Okay, so I will make this into a quarter note to leave room for my NCTs. And then what I'll do is I'll use the upper neighbor of the tenor, the B flat here, but then I will go to the lower neighbor of the tenor. Okay, neither which of these is chordal in the four chord, right, that we're using here. So they're both non-chord tones, but they both relate to the tenor in that they're a diatonic step above and a diatonic step below. So because of that, and they're both non-chord tones, we would call that a neighbor group or a double neighbor. So in terms of how to label that, we would may as well circle both of the pitches. And my preferred label is just DN for double neighbor. Alternatively, you could just as easily call it an NGR for neighbor group, and both terms for our purposes will be interchangeable. But in any event, this is how we can label this particular NCT, or in this case a double NCT. So let's see how this one sounds with these other neighbors. So this is a couple of examples of ways in which I could insert neighbor notes into an existing progression. There are certainly many more places I could do it. There's lots of sustained pitches here, and given that the basic duration or the basic harmonic rhythm is the half note, there'd certainly be a lot of places for more neighboring and even more passing motion. But hopefully this is enough just to give us at least an overview.